I'm Gloria Horsley, and I'm interviewing Robert Zucker. Robert is the grief counselor and author of The Journey Through Grief and Loss, Helping Yourself and Your Child When Grief is Shared. And our topic today is shared grief. Well, Rob, I wanted to ask you, how did you get into the field of grief and loss?
Well, I guess, like many of us, it's kind of through the back door. My dad died when I was 23 years old, and that really was in a lot of ways an introduction to grief and loss, but not absolutely, because I grew up in a household with my grandmother, who was really a very, very wonderful woman who also was grieving the whole time that I knew her. And so she was really, there was a lot of secret losses in my family, but she was grieving the death of one of her children, who I never knew about because she was never spoken about in the family. But when I was a young teenager, I went with my grandmother, along with my aunts and uncle, to visit the gravesite of my grandfather. And when we got to the gravesite, a big cemetery in New Jersey, everyone, my uncle and my aunt and my cousins got out of the car, and I followed them. My grandmother came out of the car, and she went right past her husband's gravesite and fell down on the gravestone of her daughter, who I learned about then. And she was deeply bereft over a death that happened many, many years ago. And I only learned about Pauline when I saw the name engraved on the gravestone. And no one in the family ever would talk to me about Pauline. Still, to this day, she's kind of this mystery person in our family. And but I really learned a lot about hidden grief, about secrets, about lack of families having inviting environments to grieve. And when my dad died, it kind of really brought it much closer to home for me.
So now you've seen this family where the grief isn't shared, and you've written a book on shared grief.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to have shared grief?
Yeah. Well, you know, my mom said something to me that really kind of captures something where people can really miss the boat as parents. I was 23, and when my dad died, and certainly you could say, well, I was already an adult, but in a lot of ways I was still a kid at 23, like many of us are. And when my dad died, it was absolutely overwhelming in many ways. The loss was so inconceivable to me and to my siblings and to my mom. But years later, after I'm already a grief counselor for many years and I'm doing this work for many years, my mom and I were talking only a few years ago, and I was talking about the grief that I felt for my father, and she said, "Oh, you mean you grieved too?" And it was quite astounding to me to realize that even after all these years and all the sharing that we've done, she could easily fall back into this kind of assumption somehow that it wasn't a shared experience, that we shared something profound. All of us in our family share something. And I think too often parents really don't know how to really maneuver in that world of shared grief, because we as adults become so overwhelmed and insular, and we don't know how to maneuver in the mentoring role as parents.
As the child has lost a family member.
Yes.
And
yes.
so we're into our grief. I sometimes think that parents have so much trouble seeing their children grieve that that's why they cut it off.
I think so. I think, we want to make our children happy, and we want to see something positive and wonderful, and we see something horrendously scary when a child is going through great pain, and we just don't want to. If we can't fix it, maybe we move into denial on some level.
So, what suggestions would you have to a parent out there who has had a loss and has children? How do you share the grief?
Well, one of the things that I say is we want to learn how to kind of welcome children into a safe world, into a safe place that allows parents to acknowledge their pain, and also also involves parents really learning about childhood grief. And so children and parents often look very different as they grieve together, even though it's a shared loss. So it often involves parents really learning about childhood grief. And it's hard to learn when you're in it. When you're in it. So it's really that kind of, it's a profound challenge, I think, for any parent to have to begin to consider not only personal survival, but also being available. And I think part of it is willingness to learn. And there's a tremendous a need to actually begin to say, there's a learning curve that I need to enter in and begin to understand childhood grief as well as my grief. And one of the things that I like to say is that one of the things that parents can do that can be very, very important and loving for their kids is to really teach them about their grief and teach them what they've learned as they're learning. So to bring children into that kind of collaborative kind of schooling that kids can really, really benefit from.
And also read your book.
And read my book.
And thank you so much for being on YouTube today.
Day, 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 day.